I don't think in the past at least 15 years I've settled for a solid color paint scheme. I probably have to have a conversation with my painter. He's just being lazy. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In this video today, we are going to go through and do a suspension rebuild, but I'm going to get really in depth with it to the point where we're going to look at things that aren't directly related to what's within the shock body, but stuff that is totally involved with the movement of suspension. So we're going to look at things like the A-arm, we're going to rebuild a shock, and I'm going to show you some stuff along the way that I think is really important to make sure that your car is handling and performing the way that it should. Now, this car is fresh off the track, so it's a little dirty, so please excuse the mess. However, I've noticed that the car, even after a quick suspension rebuild, it just doesn't have the smoothest movement in the world when it comes to how it feels when I compress it. So the compression and the rebound, it just feels like there's a little bit of binding in areas on the car that's inhibiting its smoothest shock suspension ability. I'll go with it. What I'm talking about, sometimes when I talk to people and I ask them, hey, what's your setup? And they tell me what it is, and then I ask them, what do you have for shock oil in the car? And they tell me something like 3230 or 3530. And then I go to compress the rear end of the car, and I just kind of like have a little bit of a shocked look on my face, and I go, really? 30 weight is in there. Because it feels way stiffer, way heavier because the movement is very slow. The compression, the rebound has a lot of just friction. And that can be because the shock needs some TLC, but it could also be some things that are going on with the hinge pins and other areas where there's motion and connection of parts. I'm going to get into a shock rebuild in a second, but I want to talk real briefly about some things that may cause the car to bind and give you poor suspension movement. If you race at a track that has a lot of dust or just loose dirt, and you're doing things to keep the dirt from sticking on the car, you may add something like Pledge or SC1, some of the stuff that I use for my dirt bikes, to add kind of like a mildly oil surface coat to the plastics and stuff. And then when you go to blow it off, the dirt kind of falls off a little bit easier. However, what's happening is when you go to blow off all that dirt, a lot of that dirt is going to get blown into an area where you don't want it, which is either inside the A-arm where the hinge pin sits or areas surrounding that. So what will end up happening is there will be a lot of gunk that gets built up in there, and then it slows down the movement and the car just doesn't move freely. So that can add to a sluggish feeling suspension movement. A lot of you nitro guys out there, you might use this stuff a lot. I understand why people might spray a little bit of this on the car towards like the A-arms and then blow it off because it can be very dirty. I know some of the outdoor tracks that I race at, they can have some corrosive materials or corrosive properties in the dirt that if you leave it on the car, in a matter of hours, you can start to see rust start to form. So it's kind of like you wash it all off in trade-off that you're going to have to do a really heavy-duty rebuild on all of the areas where your hinge pins and suspension components come together. So I understand why you might use stuff like this or Pledge SC1, but just know that over time, this is not helping the freeness in your suspension. It's doing quite the opposite. So today, we're going to take it apart, and I'm going to show you what I do to clean these things to get back that nice, smooth, possibly better than new free movement. Real quick before we jump into it, the stuff that I'm going to need is just tools that you're going to need to disassemble your car, whatever's going to be appropriate there, hex wrenches, Allen wrenches, etc. But then I am going to use some metal polishes. So I like to use this classic Neverdull. This I use to clean up my hinge pins. And then this incredibly, oh dear, I don't know what happened to this logo, but this is just a paste Brasso that I use on my shock shafts. So I'll use a microfiber towel, put that on there, apply it with this. Never dull, you just take out a piece of the little fiberglass stuff and then use it on the stuff. I'll show you in a second. This TDK shock, what do they call it? TDK shock assembly is what they call it. This I use to rebuild or put in new shock O-rings. I really like this stuff. I've been using it now for probably close to 2 years, maybe even more. And it's just the best stuff that I've used for my shock rings specifically. So I've went ahead and linked that down below where you can find some of this stuff should you want to grab some. I'm gonna go ahead and switch over to the above camera view so that you guys can see what I'm doing and follow along. Okay, so now that we got a nice close-up shot of the car here, we're gonna go ahead and take these shocks off and kind of get started. But real quick, I just wanted to say that this is what we're trying to improve. The motion of the car compressing and rebounding. And the way it is now and how I know it can be, it just feels like it's time for me to go through and do all these things that I'm talking about. So let's go ahead and prop it up and get started. Oh, real quick. Do you guys like this thing here? It's pretty cool. It's a pit stand made by Team Rattle Can. I believe Ken Peterson, and I forget the other guys that are doing it over there. I met him over at the Hobbyplex, and this thing is sweet. It's got some milled aluminum that has a lot of functionality when it comes to rebuilding some stuff on your car. Like this side here it has cutouts and divots for when you're rebuilding a ball diff, I believe. And then you can put your diff in here and then you can test the tightness of it and make sure that you built it correctly. Really cool. And then we'll actually be using this other side where we have some holes to rest our shocks, or on this side here, little extra holes there for extra parts. Possibly like if I wanted to retain the little screws on the bleeder caps or whatever would be appropriate. Really cool. Just a nice little handy tool that we're going to be using today. And I just wanted to give a shout out to those guys and say thanks for sending me one. So that's them right there. Cool stuff. So thanks guys. Appreciate it. Okay, so now that we have the shocks removed, we can see that we have pretty good motion on the suspension arms, so it doesn't seem like anything's bent or broken, but we're still gonna take it apart so that we can get at all these hinge pins and kind of polish them up so that we can get the ultimate freeness out of those. So as you can see, we took the first one out and it's actually pretty dirty. All of this little gunk that's built up right there, it's not the worst that I've seen, but it definitely isn't helping anything. So we're gonna polish that up here in just a second. Taking a look at the front hinge pins, it doesn't seem like they're too bad. I can see there's a little bit of dirt on the front and the back end of it there, but not looking too bad, but we'll still polish it up just to be safe. So here's a look at our hinge pins that came out of the back of the car, and they actually don't look too bad. I've been pretty careful not to get a bunch of gunk built up back there, and it looks like our hard work has paid off. But since we're gonna do everything and everything's torn apart, I'm still gonna polish them anyways so that I know I'm getting an even start across all of my hinge areas. We will be using a drill that has an adjustable chuck so that we can put the hinge pin in here and then polish it up. Just load it up in there like so, tighten it down so it doesn't go anywhere. Now, real quick before we get started, if you guys have a very corroded and dirty, just lots of buildup that doesn't come off with just a quick polish, a little thing of Scotch-Brite or these little Brillo pads, whatever you want to call it, you can spin the drill over and just kind of hit it real quick with this, and that will expedite the cleanup process, if you will, quite nicely. This isn't dirty enough that I have to use this, so I'm just going to go right to the polishing part. And then the little end that's there, I just hit it real quick with my hand because I know this one isn't that bad. Because there's a little bit of that polishing compound left on there, just wipe it off, kind of buff it up just a little bit. And that guy is nice and smooth, good to go. And there you have it, a completely polished set of hinge pins. Now it kind of goes without saying that you want to make sure that as you're doing this, you want to make sure that none of them are bent or obviously broken, because you don't want to put that back in the car because it's not going to work well at all. So you may have to replace some of your hinge pins altogether when you go through the inspection and polishing process. But hopefully none of them are bent and you can just reuse everything that you just took out and polished up. This doesn't apply to every vehicle out there, but it may in some similar capacity. So I felt like it was worth mentioning. I have a adjustable height kind of hub system, and these little inserts are where the hinge pin, the outer hinge pin at least, travels through. And I can kind of tell that these, over time, there's just so much dirt, dust, and debris that goes through them that they just kind of wear out. And if you think about it, it's kind of silly if you take all this time to polish up your hinge pins, but then the thing that they are resting in, gliding through, however you want to explain that, is very rough, very damaged, and very sloppy. It just kind of defeats the purpose of taking this time to make sure that everything works. So we're just freshening up this particular area by putting in some fresh inserts. I don't always do this. I do this probably every few months. This isn't something that wears down all the time super fast, but I know that mine are at that point where I need to replace them, so I just thought that I would mention that so you guys know what I'm doing. I'm just going to put some new rear hubs in there while I'm at it, so everything is new. Another thing that you may want to do, because this is where the hinge pins are also resting, especially up front, is replace your A-arms. I know this may sound silly because my A-arms aren't broken, but I know that these little areas, they can become worn down and have a little bit too much slop. Like you can feel it on the car, and when you go to move it, there's just so much play, and it's because there's some gaps developing on all of these corners. So my A-arms aren't broken, but they're a little bit worn out. I know my front ones are in particular, so I'm gonna go ahead and put new ones of these in there so that I have smooth hinge pins going into fresh A-arms. Okay, now let's move on to the shocks, shall we? Okay, so now I'm going to walk you guys through what we're going to do with one of these shocks. So the first thing that we're going to do is completely disassemble it, give it a nice quick thorough inspection so that we know everything is good and we don't have any sort of bent shock shafts or parts that need to be replaced, and we're ready to do the rebuild. So this shock oil doesn't look overly dirty. I know because I had just rebuilt them recently. So I know that we're still going to strip it down so that we can get to the shock O-rings. We're going to be replacing those, and we're going to be polishing the shock shaft. Uh-oh, you guys are about to see my latest speed secret here. Let me show you. I don't know if you guys can see it, but these are the VRP game changer pistons. These things are really cool because they have a system where the compression and rebound essentially become a little bit different. So the rebound is a little bit quicker and the compression is a little bit slower. So what that does is when the car lands, it's not going to blow through the stroke as fast, but then when it's rebounding, it has a much faster reaction. So it's pretty cool. I've been using them now for a couple months and I really like them. If you guys are new to these and you haven't used them before, it's really hard to see because all the parts are really small, but there's a lot of very small machined or molded parts that you definitely don't want to lose when you take these apart. So be very careful when you're rebuilding these. Okay, so take the bottom shock cap off. There's a little bit of dirt on this guy, not too bad. Trying not to score anything or damage anything. So I like to make sure that the shock body is still in really good shape and that it hasn't had any significant damage done to it. This one looks pretty good. Because I am not super factory status, sometimes I just go ahead and reuse these parts maybe 2 or 3 times. And I just kind of re-grease them and then keep them going. But these are past that point. I know that I've done that at least 3 times to these guys here. So today we're going to be putting fresh machined inserts and shock rings. So here you can see these are the parts that we're going to be putting into our shocks today. Okay, so before we jump into polishing this guy up, really the things that I like to look for and make sure that it's still okay is going to be the surface of the shock shaft. Make sure that there are no visible scratches or imperfections, because if there is, it's really not worth trying to polish past them. A lot of times these things have a coating on them. These are, I think, titanium nitride coating on these particular shock shafts, and that's common amongst a lot of the manufacturers. So that coating is really just kind of like a, once it's messed up, just go ahead and replace the shock shaft. But if the shock shaft is still in pretty good shape and there's no visible scratches or nicks or anything like that, we can go ahead and hit it with a quick polish and bring it back to like new. There you go. Okay, now we're going to be building up our shock cartridge with the shock rings and the machined inserts. So I take a little bit of the TDK and then I make like a a cartridge sandwich. Get these things nice and coated. Okay, and then we just take our shock cartridge, put it back in like so. Now what I do is I don't tighten this down all the way, because when you do, those O-rings inside compress a little bit and they expand. And when you go to push the shock shaft through, it catches them a little bit more than if you didn't. So I back it off just a little bit, leave it kind of loose, and then I'm gonna put my shock shaft through, and then I'm gonna tighten it down. Whatever shock oil you're gonna use, I go ahead and I put just a little drop in there so that I get some oil on these O-rings, so that when I put the shock shaft through, that it's kind of helping it instead of catching on the new O-rings and scratching them. So just a little bit, just enough until it starts to drip through those O-rings. So there you can see the oil came through, so I have a nice protective coating now. Definitely don't want to force anything and damage those new O-rings. Yeah, everything feels good. And then go ahead and tighten that puppy down. Good to go. So now we just put everything back together in the reverse order. And just make sure everything moves nice and smooth. No issues there. Then obviously you're going to want to fill this up with oil. Okay, so we're going to set this one aside, let all the air bubbles come up, and then off camera I'm going to go ahead and do the other 4 shocks, and then I'll come back when it's time to bleed these bad boys. So we'll go ahead and put the cap back on and bleed this thing out. Ooh. Just hand tight is going to be plenty. Go ahead and grab your spare rag and then push the shock shaft till you start to see some oil come out. So just to show you, the shock shaft is completely compressed, and then we got all that excess oil out. So then go ahead and put your bleed screw back in, and we're not done yet. Now, what I like to do is I pump up the shock a few times and I check the rebound. So you can see that we still have just a little bit too much oil in there. So I'm going to go ahead and take this screw back out. Pull the shock down. There you can see we had that little bit of fluid that came out. Put the screw back in. And there you go. Okay, and our shock rebuild is complete. So I'll go ahead and put these back on the car along with the hinge pins and check out and see how smooth everything feels. Oh yeah, nice and smooth. That was long overdue. So, thanks you guys for joining me on my rebuild process of how to get my suspension to be buttery smooth and like new. Hopefully it helped you guys out a little bit, showing you some things that are outside of the shock body and how it can be related and cause things to be bound up. If you had any questions about the process, please feel free, drop a comment down below and I'll try and jump in there and help you guys out. I went ahead and linked down below the stuff that I used in today's video so that if you weren't too sure about what it was or where to get it, maybe an Amazon link will help you guys out so that way you can get some stuff for your shocks and rebuild them just like I did mine. Now, as promised to all of my Patreon supporters, love you guys, gonna give you guys your shout outs. All of my $10 a month Patreon subscribers, I'm gonna throw you guys up here on the screen, and I wanted to say thank you so much. Lots of stuff still happening behind the scenes to get our traveling workshop and other stuff that we are working on at the time of this video. Things are rolling, and you guys are a part of it, so thank you. Next, I have just a few spots of some big, super generous supporters over on my Patreon, and I wanted to give you guys an individual shout out as a way of saying thank you for your generous support. Tim, I'm putting your name up on the screen here. Not trying to butcher it on purpose, but I'm going to give it a shot. Tim Juskowitz? Juskowitz? I'm sorry, man. I know I'm butchering that, but thank you all the same. I greatly appreciate your support. Mr. Brad Persons. I almost said Pearsons, but I saw it. Persons. So thank you for your support. I greatly appreciate it. And last but not least, Mr. Alex Johnson. Thank you so much. All of you guys know that your support is going directly towards, at the time of this video, into building the design and the framework behind a traveling workshop. I'm really excited about it. If there's anyone else out there that wants to jump on board and support it so that we can get this thing rolling, not sure that it would happen any faster, but just ensure that we are going to get everything done that we need to so that we do this thing right. If you guys have no idea what I was just talking about, I started Patreon not too long ago. Something I've been throwing around for a while. It's not a place where I'm going to keep information behind a paywall. All of my setup tips and tricks are always going to be here on this channel for everyone. I don't intend to keep anything secretive, so rest assured. If you feel like supporting the cause and the other things that I'm trying to work on and put together behind the scenes, then definitely go over to my Patreon and hop on board should you feel so inclined. Definitely not necessary, but I appreciate any and all support that comes my way. So that's going to be it for today's video. Hope you guys liked it. Hope it gets your suspension feeling nice and silky smooth and those cars gripping and a-ripping on the racetrack. If you had any questions, drop them down below. You know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe if you're not subscribed. We're such a small community, and every subscription, I feel like it's doubly important than another normal subscription somewhere else because we're so small. So every time you guys like, comment, and subscribe, it tells YouTube it's alive, it's here, and more people need to join us because it's a lot of fun. Thanks, you guys. I will see you in the next one. Peace.